Hello, welcome back to the channel, and this is a channel where we give you reviews, playthroughs, unboxings. We generally like to talk a load of bollocks about tabletop gaming in general. In this video we're going to be talking about an Ameritrash game that features the often overused theme of Lovecraftian horror. We're going to be talking about Eldritch Horror, and in this game you'll be taking on the role of an investigator. You'll be traveling around the world trying to get clues that will allow you to defeat the ancient old one that will allow you to win the game. So in this video we're going to be giving you a very brief overview of the rules. We're telling you what we do like, we don't like, and we'll come back and we'll tell you whether or not Eldritch Horror is still worth playing. Was it 2014 it was first released? Well, we'll say 7 years after it was first released. So remember, if you're new here, please consider subscribing to this channel. Leave a comment in that section down below. We'll see you after this. Bollocks! So, Eldritch Horror, how do you play this game? So first thing you're going to do is you're going to choose an investigator. There are several investigators in your core set. If you've got the expansions, then you're going to have an absolute plethora of characters to choose from. Each character's got a certain amount of attributes. You've got the two main attributes of health and sanity. Then you've got the attributes of law, influence, observation, strength, and will. And you'll see that each one of these has been designated a numerical value. Each character will also have a special action that they can perform. So you might have Lily Chen, whose action says you can spend any number of health or sanity, then recover an equal number of health or sanity. Or you might have Mike Harrigan, the soldier, and his action is you and one monster on your space can lose 1 health. Or you might have Trish Scarborough, the spy, and her action says if you do not have any clues, you gain a clue. So there's a wide and diverse number of investigators. It's not many in a core set. If you've got the expansions, which is pretty much a must for this game, then you're going to have a lot to choose from, right? So the next thing you're going to do is going to choose one of the ancient old ones that you're going to try and defeat, right? So again, there's not many in the core set. You're going to have the obligatory Cthulhu that you're going to be trying to do over. But if you've got the expansions, again, you're going to have a few more to choose from. And each of these ancient old ones will have different criteria to allow you to win the game. So you might have the Rise of the Elder Things, and this says that when 4 mysteries have been solved, the investigator wins the game. Or you might have Yig, and this one says that when 3 mysteries have been solved, the investigators win the game. But when Yig awakens, flip this sheet over and resolve the Yig awakens effect on the back. So you'll gather up any assets and then you'll place your investigator on the start space that your character sheet tells you, and away you go. So Eldritch Horror consists of 3 phases. You're going to have the action phase, you're going to have the encounter phase, and then you're going to have the mythos phase. In the action phase, you'll be taking actions, funny old thing, to help you prepare for the later phases. So you might take the travel action. You'll be able to move to any adjacent space, and then you may spend travel tokens to move to additional spaces. There's 2 types of travel tokens. You've got the train travel tokens, and then you've got the ship travel tokens. Obviously, you can't take the train across water, and you can't take a boat on land unless you live in some sort of unicorn infested fantasy world. So next action you could take is rest. You can just gain 1 health and 1 sanity. You can take the trade action. If you're on the same space as another investigator, you can trade some of the gear that you have looted. You can prepare for travel, in which case you'll just take a ticket of your choice, right? You can take the acquire assets action, in which case you'll test your influence. You'll roll a number of dice that's equal to your influence stat, and then dependent on how many 5s or 6s you roll, because in this game 5s and 6s are considered successes, you'll take any assets that are equal to or lower in value than that number, right? So some of the assets that you can acquire, you might be able to entertain the assistance of the chief inspector. He's an ally, and he tells you that you can gain 1 observation and gain 2 observation during research encounters. You might be able to nick an occult text, in which case you'll gain 1 will during combat encounters, and monsters you encounter lose physical resistance. Or you might be able to appeal to the council. This is a service, and when you gain this card, you may immediately spend 2 clues to retreat the Doom track by 1. So the Doom track is the track at the top of the game. The ancient old one will tell you where to place the counter on this track, and if the Doom track ever goes down to 0, then you are stuffed. So the final action you can do is the component action. This basically means that you can take an action where any component has the word action on it, right? So once you're done taking actions, then you will start the encounter phase. So starting with the lead investigator, that's the first player, then everyone will take one encounter. There's loads and loads of different types of encounters that you can choose from depending on where you are on the board. If there's a monster on your space, then you're going to have to encounter the monster first, and then if you successfully defeat the encounter without getting your head kicked in, then you'll be able to take an additional encounter, right? So there are location encounters. You look at the location you're on, and then you'll draw a card associated with that space, and then you'll resolve the encounter that is on the card. There's encounters you can take dependent on tokens that are on your space. So you've got the clue token encounter, and you'll draw a research encounter card and resolve that. You've got the gate encounter, you'll draw an otherworld encounter card and resolve that. You've got the expedition encounter that moves around the board dependent on what the next card is. And then there's rumors as well, which are generally really, really bad. So the next thing you'll do is you'll resolve a Mythos card. In the setup, you'll choose different difficulty Mythos cards and you put them into a stack, and as the game progresses, the Mythos cards will get more and more difficult to negotiate, right? First thing you'll do is you'll advance the Omen track 1 space clockwise around the track, and then you'll advance Doom by 1 for each gate on the board that matches the Omen token's current space, right? Like we said, if the Doom track ever gets down to 0, you are stuffed. You'll resolve anything on the board that has a Reckoning icon on it. These are also really, really bad. Then you'll spawn a number of gates on the reference card. This is where monsters come out of the gates, and their sole purpose is to try and make your life a bit of a misery. Then if the Mythos card tells you to, you'll do a monster search, and basically at each gate that matches the Omen token's current space, spawn a number of monsters shown on the reference card. The reference card is a neat way of scaling the game depending on how many players are playing the game, right? So obviously if you're playing with 2 players, you're not going to be spawning as many monsters as if you're playing with 8 players. I don't know why you want to play with 8 players, but sometimes you just have to be a little bit sadistic. Then you might be able to spawn clues. You'll take a clue token and you'll place it on the space that the clue token tells you to. You might place a rumour token. You place a rumour token on a space, and like we said, you may be able to fulfill a rumour token as an encounter, right? And then the card might tell you to place Eldritch tokens. I'm not going to go into that because I don't want to bore you to death or make you more bored than you already are. So a large part of this game is doing over monsters. You will have to have a combat encounter, and when you have a combat encounter, the first thing you'll do is you'll check the monster effects to see if anything happens, whether they are going to buy you a cup of tea or not. Then you will have to resolve a will test. You'll chuck a number of dice that is equal to your will score, and if the monster's horror is greater than the number of successes rolled, you lose a sanity equal to the difference, right? Then you resolve a strength test. Same thing, you roll a few dice, and if the monster's damage is greater than the number of successes you rolled, lose health equal to the damage. The monster will always lose health equal to the number of successes rolled, and the monster and the investigator will always lose health at the same time, right? You'll keep trying to fulfill the win conditions that are on the old ones card, and if the Doom track ever gets down to 0, you're going to be stuffed, because that means that the old one will start to awaken, and you'll resolve the nightmare scenario that is on the old one's sheet, right? If you manage to negotiate the old one's awakening, then you will win the game, but if you don't, then you are going to lose the game. You also lose the game if all the investigators are eliminated from the game. But if you manage to defeat the old one, you will be the winner of Eldritch Horror. So what do we like about Eldritch Horror? First thing that we like about Eldritch Horror is that it shortens the Arkham Horror experience. Previously to this, the 2 board games that people were going to flock to was Arkham Horror First Edition and Arkham Horror Second Edition. Arkham Horror Second Edition was famous for having too much bloat. It was too long, it was too big. It used to take you about 6 hours to play. This one, if you've got the core set, you can knock this one out in about an hour and a half, 2 hours, maybe even less if you're playing with less players. So at the time when this was first released, right, it was a breath of fresh air, and it made Arkham Horror, or the Lovecraftian board game type thing, more accessible to more people. The second thing that we like about this game is the fact that they released quite a few expansions and gave you more variety. Okay, we're contradicting ourselves by saying that it shortens the experience, but the expansions don't necessarily make the game that much longer. They just add more variety. So some of the expansions are essential. You can take or leave the big box expansions, which add sideboards, but you've also got the option of taking the small box expansions, which is just going to give you more encounters, more variety. So that's always a good thing, isn't it? So the next thing that we really like about Eldritch Horror is that it tells a really decent story. It's in the same vein as games like Robinson Crusoe Adventures on the Cursed Island. If you do acquire some of the expansions, due to the variety, the story is never going to be the same 2 games in a row. Obviously, if you play it a lot, you're going to run out of stuff, but there's so much content in this box. If you've got some of the expansions, then the story is going to be told in a different way every time, right? And that's really, really good. So the final thing that we really like about Eldritch Horror is it is a real hardcore challenge. It's very difficult to beat this game. Okay, it might just boil down to a few die rolls, and the difference between winning and losing might be getting a couple of 5s or 6s, but it doesn't really matter if you win these sorts of games, because it's more about the experience and seeing how the story about your battle against the forces of evil develops, or more to the point, unravels. Yeah, so what don't we like about Eldritch Horror? So the first thing, and the major thing about this game, is that if you've got all the expansions, if you're stupid enough to play this with all the expansions, and I'm not talking about the sideboards, you're not going to play with all the sideboards. If you're playing with all the expansions, then there is going to be too much content to separate when you're setting up and tearing down a game. I tried to play this the other day and I gave up with the setup, because the problem being is that the cards look kind of similar and it's very difficult to tell which ones are which. You're going to have to keep referring back to the component breakdown in the rulebook. And even then, I was thinking, what card is this? Do I have to use this one? Which component am I meant to put here? So I end up giving up, and I'll come back to it later. But this setup, if you've got a lot of content, may just put you in a mental institution. So the next thing that we don't like about Eldritch Horror is that the box says 8 players. 8 players, my arse. You ain't never ever going to be able to get through a game of this with 8 players. If you do try it with 8 players, you'll probably either fall asleep or just basically rot into a pile of dust, because you're going to be waiting about 7 years for your turn to come round. Yeah. So my advice to you is don't play this with 8 players. Play it with a maximum of 4. I find that 3 is probably the sweet spot for this one. Right. Next thing we don't like about Eldritch Horror is the core set was a complete and utter bump. They were so stingy with the amount of content in there. It was obviously another Fantasy Flight cash cow. They were just trying to con you into buying some of the expansions, and you will have to buy some of the expansions in order to make the longevity of this game worthwhile. So yeah, a typical Fantasy Flight cash cow if you're only going to be buying the core set. Final thing we don't like about Eldritch Horror is that the combat is sort of confusing. Rather than use health and sanity as the 2 primary attributes, they have to change it over to horror and damage, and I can never remember which bloody one it is. Why didn't they just give monsters sanity? Okay, monsters aren't really in the position where they're going to be losing their marbles, are they? But it would have made life a little bit easier when you're playing this game. Yeah, so combat can be unnecessarily confusing. That might just be the fact that I'm thick as shit. So to summarise, is Eldritch Horror worth your time and bother today and in the future? So we are going to say yes, absolutely. This is an essential entry into the Ameritrash catalogue, and it should be on everybody's shelf. Fantasy Flight were intentionally stingy with the amount of content in the core set, as they just wanted to try and flog you some extra stuff. But the game is that good where it does actually warrant picking up some of the expansions just to flesh the game out and give you that little bit more variety. A counterpoint to this is that if you do go and get some expansions, it makes the game sort of maybe just as bloated as the Arkham Horror 2nd Edition you're trying to get away from, right? But having said that, this is without doubt the best Lovecraftian themed board game that you can pick up today, and as such we highly recommend it on this channel. So there you go, that's Eldritch Horror. Remember, if you're new here, then please consider subscribing to this channel. Leave a comment in that section down below. We'll see you next time.